there. Welcome to this special edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos coming to you from Ottawa. Today we're looking at the top 5 political news stories of 2020. It's been a year like no other, and we're going to go through the major political events with our Power panel. In Toronto, Amanda Alvaro with Pomp and Circumstance. Over in Ottawa, Sherelle Evelyn, managing editor for The Hill Times. Summa Strategies' Tim Powers is also in Ottawa, as is Earnscliffe Strategy Group's Kathleen Monk. Hi, everybody. Let's get started. Here is a look back at our pick for number 5.
I will build a team that is ready to beat Justin Trudeau.
I will be a champion for the Conservative Party.
The stakes are very high, and I think the expectations are much higher.
Derek Sloan's here. He's ready to rumble. He's a no apologies Conservative.
The results for the final test: Mr. McKay, 14,528 points. Mr. O'Toole, 19,271 points.
You have given me a clear mission to unite our party. I have a track record of always voting in favor of rights, whether it's the rights of women, whether it's the LGBT community. We are stronger and more united than ever before.
Canadians want their lives back, Mr. Speaker, and they've only asked one thing from this government. What is the plan?
Hard to believe that race was only just taking place this summer. Tim, I'll start with you. I have to start with you. What did the Conservatives pick the right person?
I think they picked the right person in the end, but what a surprise. When the race started, of course, McKay was the prohibitive favorite. He had many stumbles along the way, and Aaron O'Toole ran a flawless campaign, and he proved that a good plan can carry you even against a better-known opponent. I think Otoole in his first 100 days has generally performed pretty well. He's had a couple of minor mistakes, and he's leaps and bounds better than Andrew Scheer, so that was the last yardstick that you had. So I think Conservatives are generally as content as they can be, because Conservatives don't like to be too content for too long, as we know, with the leader that they have. But I will say this, Vassy, the pandemic took the heat out of many things this year and made the focus on public health. It certainly took the spotlight off the Conservative leadership race, and it's taken a lot of oxygen away from Aaron O'Toole and opportunities he's had to position himself. So perhaps a lament for the pain of the pandemic from the politics of the Conservative side.
Sherelle, what do you think Mr. O'Toole has succeeded at so far, and what do you think the biggest challenge for him is ahead?
I think he's succeeded at casting the Conservative Party in a different light than it's been in the last couple of years. You know, he's talking about, you know, it's a party for everybody. He wants people who look in the mirror to see a Conservatives, you know, maybe if they're union members or people who haven't traditionally voted for Conservatives in the past. I think he's doing really well at pushing that message. Whether or not it's resonating, that's obviously yet to be seen. He's still falling into the traps, however, of the past and of, I guess you can call it, maybe the more potentially fringe elements, not so fringe elements of the party that they want to keep. You know, they want to keep that base, the people who say that, you know, radical, you know, left-wing cancel culture is destroying the country. You know, Mr. O'Toole got caught recently, you know, downplaying the impact of residential schools as a way to, you know, own the libs for young Conservatives at university. So he's still falling into those traps that, you know, are a little bit of a they're a little bit self-owned, self-laid traps, but I think he's still trying to find the balance of bringing more people in while pandering, if you will, to that base that plays a very large part in the party. Because look how well, you know, social Conservatives did under competitor Leslyn Lewis, who backed her in droves.
Right. Amanda, what do you think about that point?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, you know, what the leadership race revealed is just the resilience of the social conservative movement and this fissure, this deep divide within the party itself. And the problem with the leadership race is that it's a bubble. You're only appealing to your base. And what Aaron O'Toole, I think, recognized both within the race itself and as he emerged from it as leader was we have to broaden this base. And it's not enough enough to just give lip service to the issues that Canadians are preoccupied with. We have to actually answer to some of them. So for a long time, whether it was Stephen Harper or Andrew Scheer, they were able to sort of compartmentalize that part of the party wing and some of the issues that dominate that part of the wing. And now Canadians are demanding that politicians answer to some of these issues. So you have to appease part of your caucus and part of your base. And at the same time, if you have any hope of beating the Liberals in the next election, you have to broaden more widely. You have to attract people into this party, and you have to show that you're a party for everyone.
How hard is that going to be for Mr. Otoole to do, for any leader of the party to do, Kathleen?
I think it's really challenging for him. I think because of COVID, it's impossible for him to break through in the news cycle now. I think he's valiantly tried on a few cases, certainly on the vaccine distribution, but it really didn't punch through. Canadians don't know him when you review public opinion polling. They don't really know who he is and what he's about, although he does present very authentically, and his communication is really strong. His team is really strong. He has a very strong chief of staff and director of communications, and he's doing the right things. He just can't break through. But what's interesting, if you scroll back to the actual Conservative election night, the day of the election, it was in the middle of August. What also happened in August? Well, the We scandal and the cabinet shuffle and the news that we were going to prorogue. So they were drowned out in August, and they've also been drowned out this whole year by the pandemic. But how Aaron Otoole has navigated that is always looked towards, as Amanda and others have pointed out, is this growth strategy. So he was not the presumed front runner, right? It was McKay. He came in second on the first ballot, and how he won the leadership was in fact taking the majority of votes on second and third ballot, right? Picking up that support from Sloan and from Leslyn Lewis and growing his base. Also key to his win really was the fact that he had more even support across the country than McKay did. McKay was shut out of Western Canada, whereas Otoole got that, the kingmaker endorsement from Premier Jason Kenney. And with that endorsement also comes some baggage from Kenney, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how Otoole continues to navigate the burdens of the Conservative brand going forward. But it's certainly one of the underreported stories, because in a normal year without a pandemic, without
huge.
kind of, it would have been huge, right?
Yeah. Just another example of what an interesting and unique year it's been. Okay, we're going to take a break. That's all the time we have for our number 5 political news story of 2020. But stay with us, because number 4 is up next. Welcome back to this special edition of Power in Politics. Today, we're going through the top 5 political stories of 2020. We started with the number 5, the Conservative leadership race and Aaron Otoole's victory. Now for number 4, an issue governments and public officials have really struggled to address this year.
No justice, no peace! No justice, no peace!
Indigenous communities and people are being treated poorly every single day.
Systemic discrimination is real, and they happen here in Canada.
I don't see a system, an organized system in the police community or anywhere that is having discrimination as a system.
I've honestly heard about 15 or 20 definitions of systemic racism, and if it refers to an unconscious bias that exists, and we definitely have that in the RCMP.
Far too many Black Canadians and Indigenous people do not feel safe around police. It's unacceptable.
I was struggling with the definition at that point, because at that point I'd heard many different ones. I would never say that there's no systemic racism, and for that I apologize.
We need to move beyond whether or not there is racism and or systemic racism within the RCP and start focusing our attention on how do we fix it.
Because why can't we act? Why can't we do something to save people's lives?
I'm here with the Power Panel to talk about systemic racism and the way in which governments respond to it or have addressed it. Amanda, Sherelle, Tim, and Kathleen are with me. Amanda, I'll start with you. This is obviously a hugely relevant issue in this country, but it was really punctuated by all of us witnessing the death of George Floyd in the United States at the hands of police, and the protests that sparked south of the border, which really highlighted the issues that we have to deal with here.
Yeah, and it just really cracked the issue wide open. There was no hiding from it. There was no two-day news cycle. This was an issue and a movement that captivated, dominated all of our channels, all of our social channels, and then distilled right into the conversations that we were having through news sources, but also around our kitchen tables. I mean, this was outside of, probably the pandemic, this was obviously the biggest issue of the year, and how politicians responded and how they were held to account, I think was interesting to watch, because Canadians in particular, and certainly everyone around the globe, but Canadians in particular, again, were not going to be satisfied with lip service. They wanted to know in our institutions, what will change in our companies, in the brands that I buy, in the people that I associate with, in the businesses that are important to me, what will change? And I think that what they wanted to hear from political leaders was more than just an acknowledgement of what had happened south of the border, but what's happening in our backyard, in our country, in our institutions, and what powerful measures will take place in order to prevent it from continuing to persist. The one other note that I'll make is, I think that the Prime Minister did a good job in terms of communication around this issue, but I think the politician that really stood out for me was Jagmeet Singh. I think that his ability to connect with Canadians on a topic that he himself personally had dealt with, and how he felt that he was able to articulate that, was one of the more powerful moments, not just for him, but just in general across the board, a really powerful storytelling moment, and his ability to connect is something that I won't forget from 2020.
Sure. Well, there was really a wide variance in the way in which politicians and public officials addressed this, and it was highlighted by a lot of the Canadian examples. I'm thinking of Joyce Echaquan in Quebec filming that video and seeing some of the treatment that she was subjected to, or Chief Alan Adam in Alberta and what he endured. Those conversations, we played some of the clips, for example, when the RCMP Commissioner, Brenda Lucki, couldn't say at first that there was systemic racism. Premier Legault still insists that there isn't systemic racism. How do you think that impacted the way in which they were perceived and the way in which this discussion unfolds?
Well, I don't think there's been much of a change in how they were perceived, because I guess maybe speaking from my own experience or my own, I guess, life, is that you don't expect much from them to begin with. So the perception, I don't think, changed. It was interesting hearing that, that the Prime Minister has done a good job in how he's addressed this. I mean, a lot of it is, though, very symbolic. There hasn't been a lot of concrete action. Months later, after, we watched, or some people watched, George Floyd get killed by police, in a few months later, after all of this had happened, after this whole movement had happened, you still had politicians in the House talking about, well, academics should be allowed to say the N-word because that's just freedom of speech. So that doesn't really show that anybody's learned a lot in the last few months. It took a month after George Floyd's death, and a statement went out from the Prime Minister's office, from him and all the First Ministers, talking about, racism is bad, we have to do what we need to do to combat it. But the words systemic racism weren't even in that statement, because there wasn't consensus among the premiers to include it. So that just goes to show you how much still needed to be done. After the Prime Minister, went to that rally on Parliament Hill and got down on one knee, a few days later, the first real concrete thing that he said that they were going to do was look into getting body-worn cameras for the police. Well, police were wearing body-worn cameras when George Floyd was killed. So, and these aren't things that people have been calling for and asking for decades. And in the months that have passed since then, there's been a lot of talk. Well, we need to talk, we need to acknowledge this. There's been a lot of acknowledgement, anti-Black racism, systemic racism, anti-Indigenous racism. These things were mentioned in the throne speech for the first time. But we haven't actually seen the plan. The government said that, there's going to be a work plan. We haven't seen that yet. The Parliamentary Black Caucus put out, a raft of recommendations. Almost none of those have been acted on. So there's still a lot to do. And I don't think that the perception, maybe depending on from what lens you're perceiving it from, there hasn't been much change in those last few months.
Sherelle highlights, I think, Kathleen, what is the most important part of this as far as a political discussion is concerned, and that is that there are a lot of politicians and public officials talking about this, but really we have to pay close attention to what they actually end up doing.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think what this year has revealed to us is actually we're dealing with a double pandemic, one being systemic racism, which has been ongoing for decades, and one obviously being COVID. But we were able to mount the resources to attack the virus and to mobilize people. Now we need to mount the virus to deal with the racism that happens and results in things like, high rates of incarceration for Indigenous people. It results for unequal access to people to healthcare, to housing, to fair wages, even to decent work. So how will governments respond? Certainly, the government, responded in October they did roll out, promised money from 2019 for certain programs, but it's not enough, because even though we may have come to a reckoning this year as a result of the stories both in Canada and certainly in the United States that catalyzed everyone to realize the depth of this, second pandemic that we've been dealing with that has real costs and is deadly, I think that ultimately, I don't think the government is mounting the same kind of resources and really will be solving the problem in the same way. This also comes years and years after, missing and murdered women and, all the tragic stories that we've heard. Truth and Reconciliation, the stories we've heard time and time again of the Tina Fontaines of the world, and this year there are so many more. And when will it change, I think?
Tim, I'll give you the last word on this topic.
It's fascinating when you put this in context too, and this isn't meant to be a partisan shot. It's not, but you'll remember the story of racism in and among white privileged males like myself really burst out during the election in 2019 when the Prime Minister, and he obviously paid contrition for it, was captured in the blackface moment. Then we came to this awful place with George Floyd. I would say this, picking up on something Sherelle did, again, as somebody who sits at tables that makes decisions like everybody else, the only way you change racism and address it and push it back is you work on it every day. And people like me and others in positions of authority who've had the benefit of our privilege to advance ourselves need to say, we have to address it. We can't be afraid to give up opportunities and embrace and give opportunities to others, because if we don't do that, we continue to exacerbate this terrible problem.
Okay, I'm going to leave this topic there. We were talking with the Power Panel about about systemic racism in this country and the way in which governments address it. We're going to move on to our pick for the number 3 top story of the year. Let's take a listen.
Joe Biden is a puppet of radical left movement that seeks to destroy the American way of life.
If he acted 2 weeks sooner, back in March, 54,000 lives would have been spared in March and April alone.
Would you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
The question is,
radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen.
I learned so much about coronavirus, and one thing that's for certain, don't let it dominate you.
The power to change the country is in your hands.
We are going to win 4 more years.
We believe we're on track to win this election.
We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
President-elect of the United States of America, Joe Biden.
The people of this nation have spoken. They've delivered us a clear victory.
The numbers are corrupt. It was a rigged election, 100%.
Now it's time to turn the page, as we've done throughout our history.
Well, that montage pretty much sums it up. Kathleen, we're calling this a story of 2020, but really it's a much longer story that the 5 of us have been talking about for years now. How consequential do you think this election is and was?
Oh, it's huge. It's not just a top news story in Canada. It's a top news story around the world. I mean, maybe unsurprisingly, the reality TV star of Donald Trump made some pretty darn good reality TV in those final days. So many twists and turns, so many emotional roller coasters. We were all up late at night, up early the next morning, crying, drinking, doing whatever we could get by. It's been a fascinating time. And you know what? It's not over. Like the television producer and me kind of loves this story because it still continues, right? There are 74 million Americans that voted for Donald Trump, and they will continue to pose opposition potentially to President-elect Joe Biden's agenda. What happens there? You know, this entire election actually came down to some serious questions about what the world knew about America, what the world knew about the American democratic experiment, and what the world, you know, thinks of Americans. And I think that the story will continue. I mean, it's not going to end on the inauguration day in January. I think it's going to continue for some time.
Sherelle, Kathleen mentioned how many millions of Americans voted for Donald Trump. We've heard a lot from President-elect Joe Biden about reuniting those segmented factions of the country. How difficult do you imagine that's going to be?
Oh, I think it's going to be almost insurmountable. The amount of division and partisanship in the U.S. is huge right now. It's not something that's going to be healed with, you know, a few nice speeches and you know, some kumbaya moments. It's going to take a lot of work because, like you said, Donald Trump isn't going away. This isn't going away after January 20th. He's still going to be around rallying the base. I'm sure we're going to see him holding rallies and not, you know, fading into that good night. The fact that the coronavirus is still so prevalent and the way people react to it is so deeply divided, I think is going to be a real hurdle for the President-elect Biden to get over, because people are still linking the idea of, you know, the virus being a left-wing political point as opposed to a public health disaster that needs to be addressed. So even just getting people to wear masks like Joe Biden wants to do, that's going to be huge. So I think we're going to see a lot of division still for quite some time.
Tim, what's the big takeaway for Canada in Biden's win?
Well, I think there's two things from that, Vassy. First of all, if you want to play people off, play people with great extreme and insensitivity, you can do it. Because as Kathleen pointed out, Trump still got over 70 million votes. And we just finished talking about systemic racism and the need rightly to address all of the problems in the system. Trump went the other way. He played off people's anxieties, their sense that progression was in fact regression. We've seen that happen in Canadian politics. We need to be mindful of that. Even look here in Ontario with MPP Randy Hillier playing recently off all sorts of conspiracies around COVID. So that has influenced us dramatically. Secondarily, I guess the other lesson with the Biden win is sensible politicians can win and do win, but it's one hell of a fight to do it. And in Joe Biden's case, it took, to use Trump's language, 47 years to get there. But I think that the test with Biden and for other politicians watching this is how are you going to be good to your word, or are you going to fall back into that trap of so-called elitism that undid the Clintons and those before them?
Yeah, that's one thing definitely to keep our eyes on. Amanda, as you look ahead towards the inauguration and beyond, what are you watching for?
Well, it's amazing because when you play that reel, you have this feeling like we're only into our third topic right now. And how did all of this happen in 2020? It's remarkable. And we still have weeks to go until we reach the inauguration date. You know, when I think about the U.S. election, I really think about the consequences of it happening during a pandemic. There were many consequences to President Trump's presidency, but the consequences of the decisions that he made during an election year as they relate to particularly the coronavirus and the many, you know, lost lives of the American people, how many bad, poor decisions were made leading up to that election in order to secure a vote. The second outcome, the second major dire consequences is just what happened to the American people, this deep divide, this hatred that existed amongst people against one another. And I think that persists long after a new president is chosen. It persists long after an inauguration day. I don't know that we will see a lot more from President Trump. I think that there will be, I can imagine him heading back to the golf course and like kissing everything goodbye at the end of this. But the legacy that he has left behind and the turmoil that it's created amongst the people, I think we will see for some time to come.
Okay, I'm going to pause things right there. So far, we've covered the conservative leadership, systemic racism, and the U.S. election. What is our number 2 pick in the top 5 political news stories of 2020? You can find out on the other end of a quick break. Stay with us. Welcome back to this special edition of Power in Politics. We are counting down the top 5 political news stories of 2020. At number 5, the Conservative leadership race and Erin O'Toole's win. Number 4, the discussion around systemic racism in Canada. In third place, the contentious U.S. election and Joe Biden's win over Donald Trump. We've now reached our number 2 pick. Have a listen.
We know young people want and need good summer jobs, and we're going to try and make sure that they can get them. When our public servants looked at the potential partners, only the We organization had the capacity to deliver the ambitious program. I made a mistake in not recusing myself immediately from the discussions, given our family's history.
I did not recuse myself from the deliberations on the choice of administrator, and in hindsight, I should have. Today, I wrote a check in payment of $41,366. I want to apologize for this error on my part.
It raises the question whether or not there was attempt to buy political influence.
We were not chosen for this work by public servants because of our relationship with politicians.
$30 million was sent to We based on the ESDC process. As soon as this program was put into a political nature, we immediately decided that we would not be taking any of those funds.
I'll be stepping down as Finance Minister and as Member of Parliament for Toronto Centre.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a cover-up.
They were trying to help themselves out, and as a result, students suffered.
We're back with the Power Panel to talk about that. Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, Kathleen Monk, and Sherelle Evelyn. Sherelle, it's another one of those stories that I can't believe was all the way back in the summer. It feels like a lot of time has passed since then. How impactful do you think this was for the government?
Well, I think it played a pretty big role in the whole, prorogation thing that happened during the summer, and with the whole losing a finance minister. So I think it was pretty impactful for the government. What we saw or didn't see, as the months have gone on, is a real, I suppose, lasting shadow for the government in terms of general public interest. It's still, I think, of political interest. Politicians are still talking about it. They're still pushing it. They're still raising it. Still holding press conferences about it and the alleged cover-up. So that's still a thing. But it's one of those things that it became so big and so nebulous, and there were so many branches of it that it kind of became look over there and look over there and look over there, and there wasn't ever aside from, I think, Bill Morneau's $41,000 check to We and his subsequent resignation, there was never that really smoking gun silver bullet that the government said, okay, they've got us and we've got to get out of the way.
A couple of things, Amanda, I'm interested to get your thoughts. First of all, this story broke at a time when the pandemic was waning in much of the country, so there was a lot of focus on it. There were certainly consequences. We saw that with the resignation of Bill Morneau, and we did see the Liberals take a hit in the public opinion polling at the time, which they've since rebounded from. The message from opposition parties is that this is part of, though, a greater pattern of behavior. From that perspective, do you think that message hits, will continue to hit, or do you think the damage has been done and Liberals are moving on?
Well, just a quick note before we get into it that the charity that I founded, Artbound, provided donations to We Charity for their international work. So just like to disclose that. Listen, I think because of that, I've taken a huge personal interest in this story. And I think that, Sherelle raises a lot of good points in that for a time, in this moment in time, there was a lot of attention surrounding this. And how that plays out in the next election, or how the Conservatives are able to re-trump up this storyline, is something that we'll all have to wait and see. But when this scandal broke in the middle of a pandemic, waning or not, I mean, it still was such an enormous thing, that was happening all around it. So its shelf life was a little shorter. But I think for me, the real challenge of this story was, this is kind of the grossest side of politics. When a party is prepared to go all in for political gain, consequences be damned. And there were massive consequences. The student grant program was decimated. So at the end of the day, it looks like We Charity was the charity that could have delivered it because nobody else did. There were consequences to the charity itself. 7,000 schools now without that programming, millions of students who won't have access to it. So there are many consequences. I just don't think those consequences landed at the feet of the Liberal Party, and that was the intent of the Conservatives. So I do think that, could it, find itself to be an arresting moment 2 years from now? Potentially. But I would say that when the wind is out of the sails, it's very difficult when it's diluted to that extent to bring it to, the front of the public consciousness once again. I think that the ship has sailed.
What do you think, Tim, about that? Is it, and again, I sort of circle back to my question around the opposition says this is part of a bigger issue. Does that have any impact in the more long term? Or, like Amanda says, did this have its impact and now, as she puts it, the ship has sailed?
Well, the ship has sailed with a former finance minister on it, on its way to Paris, where he's hopefully going to be, in his mind, the head of the OECD. Anytime you take down a finance minister or finance minister, that's a big story, guys. The Conservatives, the NDP, the Bloc are all going to try and point to a pattern, and I think there's elements of a pattern you can knit together. It's whether the public wants to buy it at that period in time. Look, the sponsorship scandal that the Conservatives were pushing on the Liberals for years started in 2000, if I recall, with the story of the Shawinigan Fountain. It wasn't until 2005 that it bit. So, I think it'll be a while before this comes to the fore. But look, Amanda's been very honest and open about her passion and work that she's done with We. But look, to suggest that the government wasn't in error here, just beyond the communications, is wrong. Like, they screwed up due diligence. You don't write a $1 billion program on the back of the napkin and think it's going to go well because the people in this case, the Kielburgers and the We Charity, you've had good relationships with, they're good guys. That was a major error here in the beginning, and I think it's potentially opens the door to more accountability challenges with the Liberals when we get past COVID or we get further into COVID. We've seen this recently with CERB. So accountability, always a Liberal point of vulnerability, was exposed here.
Kathleen, last word to you on this.
Yeah, I don't think that we're going to know the full impact of the We scandal until the pandemic is in the rearview mirror. And I think that, while I didn't agree with everything that Amanda said, I think she was fair in her analysis, certainly, that we just have to wait and see that it could be raised again with some difficulty by opposition, but it could be raised in the next election. So I think be wary of that. But I think the more interesting thing really about the We scandal, I mean, I'm still upset the government not having the faith and the trust in its own public service to deliver the program, because I think it could have been delivered well by our public servants. So that was really a fatal mistake. But let's take away the opposition weaponizing the whole We scandal, which let's remember, it went basically from late June all the way through to, I guess it still was brought up in, the whole summer. There was a whole hot summer of We scandal mess is what it was. But let's not forget also that there was also, in turn, the Liberal Party itself, a series of leaks and counter leaks, right, about Morneau, and then, the PMO against, Morneau back, and it was all this fight for narrative, and this fight that, there was a conflict between the PMO and the finance minister, that he was taking it more on an economic, he wanted the policy measures to be more economic focused, they had a more of a political communications focus to some of their programs, and that fight resulted really in essentially his undermining and then him essentially resigning, and that, I think, is quite damaging to the party itself and show some of the history of liberal infighting. And so, they're going to need to work on that and make sure that there's no more of that in addition to any scandals that might pop up.
Okay, I'll leave this topic there, but find out our pick for the top political news story of this year in just 2 minutes. Stay with us here on Power and Politics. Welcome back to this special edition of Power and Politics. We're counting down the top 5 political news stories of 2020. At number 5, the Conservative leadership race, which ended with Erin O'Toole's winning bid to lead the party. Number 4, the issue of systemic racism in Canada and how political leaders addressed it. Number 3, the U.S. election and the defeat of Donald Trump. And at number 2, the We Charity controversy that overshadowed the federal government's pandemic management for weeks and months during the summer. You can probably guess pretty easily what the number 1 political issue of the year is. Have a listen.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
Postpone or cancel all non-essential travel outside of Canada.
Canada and the United States have agreed to stop non-essential travel.
Wash your hands. Stay home if you're sick.
Enough is enough. Go home and stay home.
It's about your parents and your other family members and your grandparents.
If you can't keep the 2-meter distance, remember that mask.
$27 billion in direct support to Canadian workers and businesses.
If we don't act now, we could lose many more lives.
We need to take immediate action. We need to take radical action.
We're in the second wave.
Some areas of the province continue to experience very high rates of transmission.
I'm the guy who's stealing Christmas to keep you safe.
The first COVID-19 vaccine, safe and effective for use for Canadians today.
Vaccine is great news. I agree with the Prime Minister, and I appreciate him voting for our motion to have a plan.
Our Power panelists are here to discuss the top news story of the year. Amanda Alvaro, Sherelle Evelyn, Tim Powers, and Kathleen Monk. Kathleen, how I wish I was saying this was just a story of 2020. We'd be putting it to bed in 2 weeks. Sadly, I can't. I've never covered anything like this in my entire life. I hope I never do again. When it comes to the political aspect of the pandemic and government's response to it, what is your big takeaway?
Yeah, well, certainly the pandemic itself is extraordinary and once in a century, but certainly I think the politics and what we've seen over the last 9 months has been extraordinary as well, too. Nothing that I've seen ever before or studied in the past in terms of our political history books. We saw, balanced budgets out the window. We saw tens of billions of dollars being rolled out really quickly with the encouragement of the other parties, right, and the support of the other parties. Extraordinary cross-partisan support for these measures. We saw policy evolving at light speed. We both, Sherelle covers it, and obviously Amanda and Tim and I all work with policy in politics, trying to change policy, and the policy was developing at such light speed. New programs, new ideas being tabled and moved through Treasury Board at lightning speed. We also saw really how politics changed, right? Could you roll back to February and imagine Premier Doug Ford being best friends with Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland? It wasn't to happen, but it was the nature of the pandemic that really changed politics, changed our approach to policy. It changed other things, obviously, in our own lives, our approach to education, our approach to parenting, working from home, broadcasting from home. Lots of change. But I think on the political level, it's really been the nature of the cross-partisan support and the lightning speed that policy moved.
And there are certainly some exceptions, Tim, to that. But overall, the level of cooperation between different parties in government and different levels of government has been something to see.
Well, what was the Prime Minister's stat last week? 23 First Ministers meetings. 23, that could be 2 decades worth of First Ministers meetings in 9 months. But I think the sad potency of this story is that unlike 9/11, which was maybe the biggest story for all of us of our era, where the world changed, it didn't necessarily impact us directly. This has impacted all of us personally in the ways that Kathleen has outlined a moment ago, but then it's impacted our politicians. Erin O'Toole had COVID-19. Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau had COVID-19. Monsieur Blanchet had COVID-19. Boris Johnson had COVID-19, Emmanuel Macron, leaders, people got COVID-19. We consume this every day because it influences what we choose to do and what we can't do. It is so powerful, and it is shaping political legacies. Will the Prime Minister now has, we talked about a moment ago, is in a very good place politically. He may go to the polls in the spring based solely on how he's managed all of this. We saw 3 premiers get reelected because they were seen at the time as good custodians of all of this. And today, and I'll be quiet after this, today we're now seeing more fraying, though, about the management in Ontario, Alberta, and elsewhere about you're not managing this the right way. So does this become the undoing of political careers as opposed to the making of them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And certainly, as Amanda, as the pandemic goes on, it seems like the focus has shifted a bit that way because people are tired, because the approaches are different depending on the province, and because we're still living with this 8-9 months in, and will be for a little bit next year at least.
For sure. And when you look at the other topics that we've covered, there was at least some roadmap, some blueprint of how you deal with issues of those magnitude. And then you look at the pandemic and it came without any of that. The unprecedented nature of it was really, and then the Herculean response to it, not just from political leaders of all stripes and how parties came together, but obviously to the people who were on the front lines. It was remarkable, and it remains remarkable. But I think that where we're at today is that, a fatigue has set in, and where we started was sort of a trust in the officials and the people who were at the helm who would kind of guide us through it. There was, funds that were being released in record time, as Kathleen said, that helped people get through those early stages, and relief to businesses and rent relief, and then the procurement of vaccines, and all of these things really required a certain amount of trust from the public that, the people, the custodians, the guiders, those who are making decisions were doing it on our behalf. But a fatigue has also set in now, and it's it's the holidays, and we can't see our families. And so, do we move from this period of trust and really respect for the people who are making those decisions to this wearing out and this feeling of this, a little bit of distrust and concern about the decisions that are made? And I think we're seeing that particularly at the provincial level with a number of those political leaders. And while, Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister has really been afforded, he's doing really well in the polls. But what does that look like when we're 12 months in or 18 months in and we're still all contending with what feels like the never-ending pandemic?
It sure does. Sherelle, last word to you on this.
I think politically going forward, it'll be interesting to see how leaders deal with all of the things that have been, I suppose, unearthed by the pandemic or laid bare or had a spotlight shown on it. I mean, there's the systemic inequities in, racialized communities with worse health outcomes, people not having, paid sick leave, businesses and their accounting measures and how the government's programs affect the self-employed. All of those things, I think, are going to be kind of come home to roost a little bit once things have really settled down and the vaccine is more widespread and people can start getting back to their quote-unquote normal lives. What we do from here on out, I think, is going to be just as interesting politically as what has been done in the last, how long's it been? A year, 10 months?
Forever.
8 years?
Forever.
I think that'll be really interesting going forward politically because we don't know what's coming. We didn't know what was coming in January. I mean, we thought the biggest story of the year could have been the fact that Iran shot down a plane carrying, almost 90 Canadians on it, or that the Wet'suwet'en and rail blockades were happening, or that we had a minority government and we didn't know when it was going to fall, and it could have been on anything. So, it's really covered every base of political life, and it's going to do so going forward for, I think years to come.
I have about 30 seconds left, so I have just enough time to ask each of you if you think there's going to be a federal election next year. Kathleen, do you think there will be?
For sure, 2021.
For sure. Okay, Tim?
Yeah.
I'll bet you a case of sparkling water on Vassy.
You know my weakness. Amanda?
I'm not a betting person, but I'm going to say yes.
Okay, and Sherelle, finally, you think there's going to be an election?
Just to be contrary, I'm going to say no.
Oh, well. I like that. Yeah, you'll be the. We'll see how that.
Wine.
Yeah, we'll see how that unfolds. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I can't thank all four of you enough for not only tonight, making the time for tonight, but for our regular Wednesday Power Panel. It's been a tough year, but you've been such a bright spot, not just for me, but for our viewers and for our show, and we appreciate it so much. Thanks to Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, Sherelle Evelyn, and Kathleen Monk. That does it for our roundup of the top 5 news stories. We'd love to hear what you think. Send us your thoughts on social media and have a wonderful evening.